The day the lawyer's letter arrived at the Platte River girls' home, every girl in the common room laughed. Not quiet laughter, not the polite hand-over-mouth kind, but the full, ugly sound that comes from people who have spent years watching someone and waiting for them to finally get what they deserve. I stood in the middle of that room with 19 girls behind me and the matron in front of me, and I listened to the laughter roll through the space like a cold wind through cracked boards. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove, with her steel-gray bun and her permanent expression of mild disgust, folded the letter carefully along its creases, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Well, Eliza, your people have left you a windbreak without the break. I suppose even the dead can play a joke." I was 16 years old. My mother had died of childbed fever when I was 7. My father, a railroad section hand who couldn't keep a job or bottle-capped, walked off into a winter storm 2 years later and never walked back. They found him frozen beside a fence post 3 miles from the rail camp, and the railroad didn't even pay for the burial. After that, I belonged to whoever would take me. 8 months with Aunt Rilla, who needed help with washing but not another mouth at table. 1 year with the Bostwick family, who let me sleep near the stove and sent me away when Mrs. Bostwick had her own baby. 9 months at the Platte River girls' home, where I learned to sew and to keep my eyes down. 3 months with the Kerrs, who took state money for my keep and told me that books made girls ungrateful. Back to the home at 15, where Mrs. Hargrove made it clear I had used up whatever chances a girl like me was owed. I had $4, a tin cup, a winter coat worn through at the elbows, and a valise full of books I had taken quietly from the home's discard pile, seed catalogs, farm bulletins, weather pamphlets, anything with diagrams or measurements that the other girls thought was too dull to steal. The inheritance was a 160-acre homestead claim in the Nebraska Sandhills, 12 miles from the nearest town. The letter called it Half Sky Draw. The men in Forked Wells, I would later learn, called it something else. They called it the 50-foot grave. The claim had a shack with a sagging roof and a barn with a crooked door, and between them 50 feet of open ground that turned into a killing field every winter when the wind came down from the northwest. The woman who had owned it before me had bought it for $18 and a filing fee, which tells you everything you need to know about what the land was worth. She had lived there alone for nearly 30 years, and the whole county thought she was crazy. She spent her summers measuring wind and her winters stacking hay bales like Sunday school blocks, and when she died in a cold kitchen after 3 days trapped by snow. That was my inheritance. A wind-flayed quarter section with a well that froze solid every January, and a 50-foot walk that had already killed cattle and would happily kill me too. But standing there in that common room with the laughter still echoing off the walls and Mrs. Hargrove's words still hanging in the air, something happened that I cannot fully explain. I looked at that letter, at the measurements, at the distances, at the careful description of the property's layout, and something lit up inside me. Not a match, a furnace. Because the letter said the walk from the kitchen door to the barn door was 50 feet, and my mind didn't hear danger first. It heard a number. It heard something that could be measured, and anything that could be measured could be understood. If you want to find out what I did with that 50-foot death trap in the middle of Nebraska, how a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a suitcase of stolen books and $4 to her name turned the most mocked homestead in the settlement into something that saved an entire valley, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I built on that wind-scoured land, what I stacked and measured and tested while everyone around me was laughing, is a story that still stands in those sandhills today. I left 3 days later. Mrs. Hargrove didn't try to stop me. I think she was relieved to have one less mouth to account for, one less girl who read too much and asked too many questions. I carried everything I owned in a single valise, $4, a tin cup, a winter coat worn thin at the elbows, and a stack of books I'd taken quietly from the home's discard pile. Nobody came to see me off. The wagon driver was a man named Krebs, who hauled freight between the rail stop and the settlements farther west. He charged me $1.50 for the ride, which left me $2.50 to start a life. He didn't talk much, which suited me fine. I sat on a crate of nails and watched the land change. For the first few hours there were still trees, cottonwoods along the creek beds, a few homesteads with windbreaks planted, Then the trees got smaller and farther apart. Then they stopped entirely. The road, if you could call it a road, turned from packed dirt to sand ruts that made the wagon lurch and sway. The grass went on forever in every direction, laid flat by wind that never seemed to stop. Krebs pointed with his whip when we reached the lane. He didn't get down to help me with my valise. He just said, "Half-mile that way, good luck with it." Then he turned the wagon around and left me standing in grass that came up past my knees. I walked that half-mile with the wind at my back, pushing me toward whatever was waiting. The shack came into view first, gray boards, a roof that sagged in the middle, one window with a piece of burlap nailed over a crack in the glass. Beyond it, maybe 50 feet, stood a barn. Not a big barn, just a low structure with a patched roof and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. 50 feet. That was the distance Mrs. Hargrove had laughed about. The 50-foot grave, the men in town called it. Standing there in the thin October sun, I couldn't see why. The distance looked like nothing, a few seconds' walk. What I didn't understand yet was what that distance became when the wind turned to knives and the snow came sideways and the world disappeared into white. The shack smelled of mouse droppings, lamp soot, and old meal. The door screamed on its hinges when I pushed it open. Inside, one cot frame with a mattress stained yellow and brown, one shelf with 3 cracked mason jars, a stove that had been drawing poorly for years based on the soot patterns on the ceiling, and a nail in the wall with an apron still hanging from it. Someone had stuffed rags into the gaps between boards where the wind came through. I set my valise on the cot and stood there breathing. The wind found every crack in the walls and made them whistle. I could hear mice in the walls. The stove was cold, and I didn't have matches yet. I was 16 years old, alone on a piece of land 12 miles from the nearest town, with $2.50 and no idea what I was doing. The barn was worse. I walked those 50 feet in the late afternoon light and found the door wouldn't close properly. The frame had warped over time. Inside, 3 stalls for cattle I didn't have, a hayloft with half the boards missing, and the smell of old manure and rotted straw. The roof leaked in 2 places I could see, and probably more I couldn't. The well stood between the barn and the shack, and when I dropped a pebble in, I heard it hit ice. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the stove, though the draw was so poor the smoke made my eyes water. I ate the last of the bread I'd brought from the home and drank water from a bucket I'd hauled up from the well, cracking through a skin of ice to reach it. I wrapped myself in every piece of clothing I owned and lay down on the cot and listened to the wind testing every seam of that shack. I did not sleep well that first night. I kept thinking about Mrs. Hargrove's face when she read the notice, the way her lips pulled back from her teeth. "A windbreak without the break," she'd said. "I suppose even the dead can play a joke." The next morning I started looking for anything useful. The shack had been cleared of most personal belongings. Whoever had cleaned out Mercyvale's things hadn't wanted much. But in the corner, shoved under the cot, I found a grain chest. Oak, well made, with brass hinges that were green with age. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside, a brass barometer with a cracked face, a bundle of cedar stakes marked with notches at different heights, and a rough sketch on brown paper showing the shack, the barn, and the lane between them. Lines had been drawn on the sketch, parallel lines running from one building to the other, with measurements written in faded pencil. 48 feet, 6 feet wide, 8 feet high. I didn't understand what I was looking at, not yet, but the chest was too shallow for its outside dimensions. I tapped the bottom. Hollow. I pried up the false floorboards with a kitchen knife and found what Mercyvale had really left behind. 11 ledgers, each one wrapped in flour sacking and tied with twine, each one labeled in a careful hand. Wind, snow, calving, roof failures, passages, losses, warm corners, January notes, storm signs, barn heat, and the last one, thicker than the others, for whoever comes. I sat on the floor of that shack with 11 ledgers in my lap and understood for the first time that I was not the first person to stand on this land and be called a fool. I opened for whoever comes first. The handwriting was small and precise, the ink faded to brown in places. The first entry was dated March of 1881, almost 30 years before I was born. I have bought a quarter section that everyone calls worthless. The men in Forked Wells say I'm building a grave for myself. Perhaps I am, but I have spent my life watching wind, and I believe there are things about this country that nobody has thought to measure. I read that entry 3 times. Then I turned the page. Mercy Vale had measured everything. Wind direction by month, snow depth by location, which spots drifted first, which stayed clear, where the wind deposited its load, and where it scoured down to bare grass. She had tracked temperature differences between the shack's north wall and south wall, between the barn's interior and exterior, between a spot in the open and a spot behind a stack of hay bales. The numbers filled page after page. Not poetry, not philosophy, just numbers, recorded day after day, year after year. January 12th, 1883, northwest wind, temperature at dawn, -18. Temperature behind bale stack, -6. Difference of 12 degrees. The straw does not stop cold, it stops wind. Wind is what kills. I kept reading. The morning light grew stronger. The fire in the stove burned down, and I didn't notice. My fingers went numb turning the pages. March 2nd, 1891. 2 bale walls and canvas roof over the door. Lantern held steady in passage. No flicker. Wind running over, not through. She had built things. Temporary structures made of straw bales, stacked and pinned and covered. Windbreak walls, sheltered corners for calving. A short covered passage between her kitchen door and the well, she called it the drink walk, that she rebuilt every autumn and let collapse every spring. The passage work is what matters most, she wrote. Everything else is preparation for being able to move between points. A body cannot feed cattle it cannot reach. A body cannot haul water it cannot walk to. The killing distance on this land is not miles. It is feet. It is the 50 feet between my door and my barn door. I found the entry where she had lost a heifer. January 8th, 1895. Lost yearling heifer in drift between house and barn. Distance only 50 feet. Distance is not the measure, exposure is. I found her on my hands and knees. She had stopped 10 feet from the barn door, 10 feet. She froze standing up and then fell over. I put the ledger down. My hands were shaking, and not from cold. Someone had been here before me. Someone had looked at this exact problem, the 50 feet, the wind, the winter that turned a short walk into a death sentence, and had refused to accept it. For 28 years, Mercy Vale had measured and tested and built, trying to solve the equation that everyone else had dismissed as unsolvable. And then, near the back of the ledger, I found the line that changed everything. On these plains, warmth is not made first by fire. It is made by stopping the wind. I read it again. I read it a 3rd time. Then I sat on the floor of that shack with the ledger in my lap, and I cried, not from sadness, not from fear, from recognition, from the overwhelming understanding that someone like me had come before me, had seen what I was beginning to see, had been called crazy for it the same way I would be called crazy. I was not starting from nothing. I was continuing something. A week later, I walked into Forked Wells for supplies. The town was 12 miles of bad road, and I walked it because I couldn't afford a horse and didn't have anyone to ask for a ride. By the time I got there, my feet were blistered and my stomach was hollow. I had $1.80 left after buying matches and lamp oil from a peddler who'd come by the shack. Forked Wells was a main street with a church at one end and a livery at the other. In between, a general store, a feed store, a harness shop, and a building that served as post office, land office, and occasional meeting hall. The population, I'd later learn, was around 300, mostly ranch families scattered across the surrounding grassland, coming into town for supplies and gossip. I went into the feed store first because I needed to understand what things cost, even if I couldn't afford them. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, with a beard gone gray and eyes that moved over me like I was livestock he was evaluating. "You the girl got Mercy Vale's place?" "I am." He laughed, not a kind laugh. "Nels Pruitt," he said, offering his hand and not seeming bothered when I didn't shake it. Your aunt was a customer of mine, bought more bale twine than any 3 ranchers combined. Used to joke she was building houses for mice. She was building windbreaks. Is that what she called it? He leaned against the counter. Look, girl, I don't mean to be cruel, but Mercy Vale spent half her life stacking cow feed like Sunday school blocks. She died in that shack after 3 days trapped by snow. Whatever she was building, it didn't save her in the end. I thought about the ledgers, about the measurements, about the line. Warmth is not made first by fire. She died of pneumonia, I said, after the storm, not during it. What's the difference? The difference is she survived the storm. The dying came later because she was old and alone and sick. That's not the same as freezing on the walk to the barn. Nels Pruitt looked at me for a long moment. Then he shook his head. You planning to stable weather, girl? No, I said. I'm planning to walk to my barn without dying between doors. He laughed at that too. But his eyes stayed watchful, like he wasn't sure whether to write me off or keep watching to see what happened. I bought twine and 3 pounds of beans with my remaining money. On the walk back to Half Sky Draw, I thought about what Nels had said. She died in that shack after 3 days trapped by snow. That meant the passages had failed at the end, or Mercy had been too old to maintain them, or something had gone wrong with the system she'd spent decades perfecting. I needed to read the other ledgers. I needed to understand not just what she'd built, but why it had stopped working. The first winter nearly killed me. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. By December, I had lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose. My dresses hung off me like sacks. My hands were cracked and bleeding from hauling water and splitting what little wood I could find, scrap lumber from the barn, dead branches from a creek bed 3 miles away. The wind found every gap in the shack's walls, and no matter how many rags I stuffed into the cracks, I woke every morning with frost on the inside of the windows, and my breath visible in the air. The well froze solid in January. For 3 weeks I melted snow for water, standing over the stove with a pot that never seemed to hold enough. The fire ate wood faster than I could gather it. My fingers went numb so often that I stopped noticing. I ate beans and stale bread and, twice, a rabbit I managed to trap. I learned what hunger feels like when it stops being a feeling and becomes a condition, a constant presence, a weight behind your eyes, a fog that makes every decision slower and harder. There were nights I thought about walking back to the home. Not because I wanted to, I didn't. Mrs. Hargrove's face still lived in my memory, that tight smile when she'd called me the butt of a dead woman's joke. But there were nights when the cold went so deep that I couldn't remember why I'd come here, couldn't remember what I thought I was going to prove. Nights when dying in my sleep seemed like a reasonable trade for not having to get up and face another day of this. What stopped me wasn't courage. I don't think courage had much to do with any of it. What stopped me was the 11th ledger. For whoever comes. I read it at night by lamplight, rationing the oil because I couldn't afford more. I read about Mercy's failures, about the first windbreak she built that collapsed under the weight of snow, about the passage that filled with drift because she'd oriented it wrong, about the calves she'd lost and the chickens that froze, and the winter of 1892 when she wrote, I am not sure I can do another year of this. I'm tired of being cold and being mocked for trying not to be cold. She had wanted to give up too. She had stood where I was standing and felt what I was feeling, and she had kept going. Not because she knew it would work, because she wasn't finished measuring. In February, I found a passage in the Warm Corners ledger that I'd missed before. Mercy had written about the way stacked bales created what she called dead air, pockets of stillness where the wind couldn't reach. She had measured the temperature inside a tight bale stack versus the temperature outside and found a difference of nearly 20 degrees on the worst days. The straw is not insulation in the way a wall is insulation, she wrote. It is a break. It slows the wind enough that heat can survive. Not much heat, but enough. Enough is all we need. I thought about that word. Enough. Not warmth, not comfort. Just enough to keep a body alive. By March, I had a plan. Not a good plan. I didn't have the materials or the strength for a good plan, but I had a direction. When the snow melted and I could move again, I was going to build what Mercy had been building. I was going to close the 50 feet. Spring came late that year, and when it came all at once. One week the ground was still frozen, the next, water was running everywhere, turning the lane to mud and filling the low spots with standing pools. I woke up one morning in April and realized I could smell something other than wood smoke and cold. I could smell grass, growing grass. I spent that spring doing two things, recovering and preparing. Recovering meant eating. A rancher's wife 5 miles east traded me eggs and milk for mending work. I could sew well enough, and she had 3 sons who destroyed clothes faster than she could repair them. Another family let me glean from their root cellar in exchange for helping with spring cleaning. I gained back 7 of the 15 pounds I'd lost, though my dresses still didn't fit right. Preparing meant studying the ledgers and walking the 50 feet between my shack and my barn over and over, trying to see what Mercy had seen. The lane ran roughly north to south, with the shack at the south end and the barn at the north. When the wind came from the northwest, which it usually did in winter, it hit the lane at an angle, driving snow and cold straight through. A body walking that distance was exposed on both sides and above. No shelter, no break. Just 50 feet of open air that became 50 feet of killing ground when the weather turned. Mercy's sketches showed parallel walls running the length of the lane with a roof of some kind over the top. The walls would stop the wind from the sides. The roof would stop it from above. What remained would be a corridor, a passage, where the air stayed still enough that a lantern wouldn't blow out and a body wouldn't freeze. The materials were the key. You couldn't build permanent walls out here, there wasn't enough timber, and lumber cost more than I'd ever have. But there was one thing the Nebraska sandhills had in unlimited supply: grass. And grass, when it was cut and dried and baled, became something you could stack. I spent May and June learning to bale. I traded more mending work for the use of a neighbor's baler, a hand-operated machine that compressed loose hay into dense rectangles tied with wire. It was brutal work. By the end of June, my hands were calloused in places I didn't know hands could callous, and my shoulders ached every morning when I woke up. But I had 37 bales stacked behind the barn, each one about 40 pounds, each one dense enough that I could stand on it without it compressing. In July, I started building. I marked the lane with cedar stakes, just like Mercy's sketches showed, 6 feet wide, 50 feet long. Then I started hauling bales and stacking them. The first row went down easy enough. The second row was harder because I had to lift each bale waist high. By the third row, I was using a plank as a ramp, rolling the bales up instead of lifting them. 3 days in, the whole east wall fell over. I had stacked the bales with the strings running the wrong direction. Instead of locking together, they'd been sliding against each other, and the first good wind had pushed the whole structure sideways. I stood there in the wreckage, 24 bales scattered across the lane, and I wanted to scream. I wanted to give up. I wanted to burn the ledgers and walk away and never think about windbreaks or passages or Mercy Vale again. Instead, I sat down on an overturned bale, and I cried until I couldn't cry anymore. Then I wiped my face with my sleeve and started restacking. I was on my knees, trying to figure out how to pin the bales together with cedar stakes, when a voice behind me said, "You've got the strings running crossways. They'll never hold like that." I turned around. An old man sat on a roan mare, watching me work. He was 70 at least, with a face like weathered leather and a hammer loop still tied to his old coat. His hands, resting on the saddle horn, were the hands of someone who had built things all his life, thick-knuckled, scarred, never quite still. "I know," I said. "I'm trying to figure out which way they're supposed to go." "Running lengthwise," he said, "so the stakes can pin through and catch. You put them crossways, you're just stacking kindling." He swung down from the horse, slowly, carefully, the movements of a man whose body didn't cooperate the way it used to. "August Redden, I knew your Mercy." "You knew her?" "Fixed her ridgepole once back in '96. Sat in her kitchen afterward and played checkers while she talked about wind." He walked over to the fallen bales and looked down at them like they were a puzzle to be solved. "She wasn't crazy, you know. That's what people said, but they were wrong. She was the only sane person in this whole county, She was the only one who understood what the wind was actually doing. He looked at me. His eyes were pale blue and sharp, and they didn't move away. Your Mercy wasn't building with straw, he said. She was building with common sense everybody else was too proud to see. I stood up. My knees were muddy and my hands were raw, and I had no idea if I could trust this man or not. Can you show me how to do it right? He nodded slowly. I can show you. Whether you can do it, that's up to you and the wind. We rebuilt the wall that afternoon. August didn't do much of the lifting. His back wouldn't let him, but he directed every placement. Strings running lengthwise, stakes driven through at angles to pin the courses together. The bottom row set slightly wider than the top, so the wall leaned inward instead of outward. Wind wants to push, he said. You lean into it before it can lean into you. By sunset, we had one wall standing, 24 bales high as my shoulder, running half the length of the lane. I walked behind it and felt the difference immediately. The evening breeze that had been steady all day became a whisper. The grass on the sheltered side barely moved. It's working, I said. That's not working. That's standing. Working is when you walk through it in January and your lantern doesn't blow out. He squinted at the wall, then at the open lane where the second wall would go. Your Mercy spent 28 years on this. She got closer than anybody, but she never finished it. She ran out of time. How do you know she didn't finish? Because I found her, he said quietly. After the storm in '08, took me 2 days to get out there once the roads cleared. She was in her kitchen, stove had gone out. I don't think she'd been able to reach the barn for 3 days, and by the time the storm passed, she was too sick to move. I thought about the ledgers, about the last entries in For Whoever Comes. The passage failed. The passage was half built. She was going to finish it that fall, but her hands wouldn't cooperate anymore. Arthritis. She could still write in those notebooks of hers, but she couldn't swing a hammer or lift a bale. He looked at me. You're young. You're strong. You can finish what she started. And if I can't, then you die on the 50 feet, same as a lot of folks before you. He said it simply, without drama. A fact. But I don't think you will. I think you've got your aunt's stubbornness. That's worth more than money in this country. He came back the next day and the day after that. We built the second wall. We laid salvage planks across the top, anchored with wire, and draped tarred canvas over them to keep the snow from filling the passage. By the end of August, we had a structure that ran the full 50 feet, 2 walls, a roof, a corridor 6 feet wide and just tall enough for me to walk without ducking. I tested it the first cool night of September. I lit a lantern at my kitchen door, stepped into the passage, and walked. The flame didn't even flicker. Outside, I could hear wind moving through the grass. Inside the passage, the air was still as a room. I stopped halfway, pulled off my mitten, and held my bare hand up. Nothing. No movement, no cold draft finding the gaps. I stood there in the dark, in the middle of a tunnel made of straw and canvas and scrap lumber, and I started to laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was working. Because Mercy had been right. Because warmth was not made first by fire. It was made by stopping the wind, and I had stopped it. I had closed the 50 feet. August found me there, still laughing, tears running down my face. It works, I said. It works tonight, he corrected. The real test is January. The real test is when the wind comes from the north at 50 miles an hour and the temperature drops to 30 below and the snow comes sideways for 3 days straight. He was right. I knew he was right. But standing there in that still air, holding a lantern that burned steady as a candle in a church, I believed for the first time that I might survive this, that Mercy's work might not be finished, but it wasn't wasted either. The passage was built. But the real test hadn't come. August became my teacher that autumn, and I didn't know yet how little time we would have. He came by most mornings, riding that roan mare slow and careful, bringing tools I didn't know I needed. Bale needles for stitching torn canvas, a hand auger for setting anchor posts, wire cutters that actually cut instead of chewing. He never stayed past midday. His lungs bothered him in the afternoon, and the ride home took longer than he liked to admit. But in those morning hours, he taught me everything Mercy's notebooks couldn't. How to read the set of a bale to know if it was packed tight enough to hold weight. How to angle a stake so it caught the strings without splitting them. How to lay planks so snow would slide off instead of pooling and collapsing the roof. Your Mercy understood the theory, he said once, watching me wrestle a bale into position. She could measure anything, but she never had a carpenter's hands. She knew what needed building. She just didn't always know how to build it. And you do? I've been putting up barns and sheds and line camp shelters for 50 years. I know how things fall down. That's the same as knowing how to keep them standing. He adjusted the bale I'd just placed, shifting it half an inch to the left. There. Now it's braced against its neighbor instead of just sitting next to it. I asked him once why he cared, why he kept coming out to help a girl he didn't know, working on a project most people thought was foolishness. He was quiet for a long time. We were sitting on overturned buckets outside the barn, drinking water from a shared dipper, and the silence stretched until I thought he wasn't going to answer. I had a boy once, he finally said. 12 years old. Winter of '88. You heard of that one? I had. Everyone on the plains had heard of the blizzard of 1888. It had come on sudden, in the middle of a warm January day, and killed hundreds of people between the Dakotas and Texas. The storm came in fast. We had cattle out, and my boy went to bring in 2 calves that had wandered. He was 50 yards from the barn door when the wind hit. August's voice didn't change. He said it the way you'd say the sun rises in the east. I found him the next morning. He'd gotten turned around in the whiteout. He was 30 feet from the house, walking the wrong direction. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. Mercy understood something most people don't, he continued. It's not the cold that kills you out here. It's the distance. It's the space between where you are and where you need to be. Close that distance, make it safe to walk, and you change everything. He looked at me. I couldn't save my boy, but maybe I can help you save somebody else's. After that, I didn't ask him why he came anymore. By the following summer, the passage had survived its first winter, not without damage. The December winds had torn loose 2 sections of canvas, and I'd spent a brutal morning in the snow reattaching them with fingers so numb I couldn't feel the wire. One section of the west wall had started to lean, and August and I had spent a January thaw resetting the stakes and adding cross-bracing. The spring melt had revealed rot in 3 bales at the bottom of the east wall, and I'd had to replace them before they collapsed the whole section. But it had held. Through December. Through January. Through a February storm that buried the passage entrance in a 4-foot drift that I'd had to dig out with a shovel before dawn. I had walked those 50 feet every day of that winter, twice a day at minimum, and my lantern had never blown out. Now I wanted more. The passage worked for the 50 feet between the shack and the barn. But there were other distances on the property that still exposed me to the wind. The walk from the barn to the calf pen, another 30 feet. The distance from the shack to the root cellar. The corner of the barn where I milked, which caught the full force of the northwest wind through a gap in the boards. I spent that summer expanding. August helped when he could, but his coughing had gotten worse since spring, and some days he couldn't do more than sit and direct. I did the lifting, the hauling, the stacking. By August, the month, not the man, my hands didn't feel like a girl's hands anymore. They were thick with calluses, scarred from wire cuts, permanently stained with the smell of hay and tar. 72 bales that summer. A second passage to the calf pen. An insulated corner in the barn where the milk buckets wouldn't freeze before I could carry them to the house. A windbreak wall on the south side that created what Mercy had called a shelter court, a protected space where the cattle could stand out of the wind on the worst days. I tracked everything in a ledger of my own, the way Mercy had taught me. Bale counts, labor hours, wind direction on test days, temperature differences between sheltered and unsheltered spots. By September, I had data. The insulated milk corner stayed 23 degrees warmer than the open barn on a windy night. The shelter court reduced wind speed from howling to tolerable. The passage to the calf pen meant I could check on new calves without risking frostbite. But the town still thought I was building houses for mice. I was in Pruitt's feed store that September, buying more twine, when Nels decided to make his opinions public. There were 3 other men in the store, ranchers picking up supplies before the weather turned. They all stopped talking when Nels raised his voice. "Got another load of twine for the Vale girl," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Building herself a hay maze out there, or maybe a fortress. Hard to tell the difference." One of the ranchers laughed. The other 2 just watched. "It's a passage system," I said, keeping my voice level. "For winter chores." A passage system. Nels drew the words out like they were a joke. "Hay belongs in cattle, not standing up like church walls. Your aunt spent 28 years playing with straw. And what did it get her? Died alone in a cold kitchen. She died of pneumonia after the storm because she was too old to maintain what she'd built. Same difference." "No." I picked up my twine and set the coins on the counter. "It's not. She survived. She made it through. The dying came later from being sick and old and alone. That's not the same as freezing on the walk to the barn, Mr. Pruitt. And if you can't see the difference, then I hope you never have to learn it the hard way." I walked out. Behind me, I heard one of the ranchers say something low, and Nels's laugh in response. But when I looked back through the window, one of the other men, a younger one whose name I didn't know, was watching me with something that wasn't quite mockery. Not everyone was laughing anymore, not quite. The real trouble came from Duke Tolland. Duke owned land on both sides of Half Sky Draw, 2 leased pastures that would have connected neatly if my quarter section wasn't sitting between them. He'd tried to buy the land from Mercy twice, according to August. Both times she'd refused. Now he was trying again with me. He rode up to my fence line one afternoon in late October, right when I was hauling bales for the new calving shelter. 2 of his ranch hands sat their horses behind him, not talking, just watching. "Miss Vale." He touched his hat brim, but there was nothing respectful in it. "Hear you've been busy. Mr. Tolland? Quite a project you've got going." He surveyed the passage, the shelter court, the new walls going up around the calving corner. "A lot of hay standing around doing nothing." "It's not doing nothing. It's stopping wind." "That what you call it?" He leaned forward in his saddle. "I call it a fire waiting to happen. All that dry straw, one spark from your stove, and the whole thing goes up. Takes your barn with it. Maybe takes you with it too. I'm careful with fire." "Careful doesn't stop accidents." He smiled, but his eyes didn't. "I'm going to make you an offer, Miss Vale. Same offer I made your aunt, but better. $50 for your quarter section. Cash money. You take it, you walk away, you start fresh somewhere that isn't going to kill you." $50. It was more money than I'd seen in my life. It was enough to get back to the eastern part of the state, find work, maybe rent a room somewhere warm. It was also an insult. The land was worth 10 times that, and we both knew it. Not because of the soil was sandy and barely worth farming, but because of where it sat. Because Duke wanted it, and wanting something always raises the price. "No thank you, Mr. Tolland." His smile disappeared. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. First big blow, and that whole contraption will be in Kansas," he said, jerking his chin toward the passage. "And you'll be lying in the snow wondering why you didn't take the money when you had the chance." He turned his horse and rode off without waiting for a response. His 2 hands followed, one of them looking back over his shoulder at me like I was something to be remembered. I stood there holding a bale of hay, my arms aching, watching them go. Duke Tolland wasn't going to give up. I knew that. Men like him didn't. They just waited for you to fail, and when you did, they were there with an offer that was always lower than the last one. I couldn't afford to fail. That winter was hard, but not as hard as the first. The system held. The passages stayed clear. I lost 1 calf to a breech birth I couldn't fix alone, but none to cold. By spring, I had 6 head of cattle, a milk cow, 12 chickens that August had given me as a late Christmas present, and a root cellar stocked with enough preserved food to last through another winter if I had to. The 3rd year was when people started to notice. It started with Mrs. Bell, a rancher's wife from 5 miles east. She had heard about the passage from her husband, who'd heard about it from someone in town, and she rode over one afternoon in early November to see for herself. I was in the middle of reinforcing the barn entrance when she arrived. "May I?" She gestured toward the passage. "Go ahead." She walked in. I watched her face as she moved through. The way her eyes went wide when she realized she couldn't feel the wind. The way she stopped halfway and looked up at the canvas ceiling. The way she held out her bare hand the same way I had that first night. "I can hear the storm," she said. There wasn't a storm, just the usual autumn wind, but she meant it metaphorically. "But I can't feel it." "That's the idea." She walked the full 50 feet to the barn and back, moving slowly, touching the bale walls with her fingertips. When she came out, she looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "How much would it cost to build one of these?" "Depends on how long your walk is, and whether you've got hay to spare. My walk is 40 feet, and we've got hay." I built my first passage for someone else that November. Mrs. Bell paid me in preserved meat, lamp oil, and the loan of her husband's extra wagon. By Christmas, I had requests from 2 more families. Word spread the way word does in small places, not through announcements, but through observation. Someone would visit, or hear a story, or notice that I was buying more supplies than a girl with nothing ought to be able to afford. People started asking questions. Not all of them were friendly questions, but some of them were. The woman who changed everything came in the spring of my 3rd year. Her name was Clara Baines, and she was the county school teacher, a woman about 30 years old with a teacher's certificate from Kearney and a habit of asking questions that most people thought were impolite. She'd heard about me from Mrs. Bell, and she wrote out one April afternoon with a notebook and a sharp pencil and a look in her eyes that I recognized from my own mirror. I showed her the passages. I showed her Mercy's ledgers. I showed her my own measurements, the temperature logs, the wind observations, the survival rates of calves in sheltered versus unsheltered corners. When I finished, she sat down on an overturned bucket and said, "This is field science. It's just measuring things." That's what field science is. She flipped through one of Mercy's ledgers, her pencil moving as she made notes. "Do you understand what you have here? This is 28 years of systematic observation. Your aunt was conducting experiments before most people knew what experiments were. She was testing hypotheses, recording results, drawing conclusions. She was trying not to freeze to death." Same thing. Clara looked up at me. "I'd like to write this up as a pamphlet, something I can send to the county extension and maybe some of the ranch wives in the area. Would you allow that?" "Why would you want to?" "Because this works. Because it's practical. Because women have been dying on these plains for 50 years, and half of them died walking distances that didn't have to be dangerous." She closed the ledger gently, respectfully. "Your Aunt Mercy wasn't crazy. She wasn't foolish. She was the most intelligent person in this county, and nobody listened to her because she was a woman alone on bad land. I'm not going to let that happen twice." I said yes. I didn't know what else to say. Clara's pamphlet went out that summer. Winter Passage Construction for Ranch Safety, it was called. Plain language, simple diagrams, the kind of thing a woman with no carpentry experience could follow. She sent copies to the county agent, to the extension office in Lincoln, to every ranch wife she knew. Most people ignored it, but some people didn't. The crisis came in January of 1914. I had been on the land for 4.5 years. The passage system was as complete as I could make it. 50 feet from house to barn, 30 feet to the calf pen, a shelter court, an insulated milk room, a protected calving corner. August had helped me finish the last of it the previous autumn, though his coughing was so bad by then that mostly he sat on a hay bale and told me what to do. The winter started mild. It should have worried me. Mercy's ledgers talked about mild starts and harsh finishes, but I let myself hope. December was easy. The first week of January was easy. I started to think maybe we'd get through without a real test. Then the barometer started falling. I had Mercy's brass barometer mounted on the kitchen wall, and I checked it every morning the way some people check the clock. On January 12th, it dropped 8 points overnight. By January 13th, it was still falling. The sky was clear, the air was almost warm, and every animal on the place was restless. August rode over that afternoon, moving slow. He looked at the barometer and didn't say anything for a long moment. "Get your hay in," he finally said. "Get your water hauled. Check every anchor and every stake. You've got maybe 24 hours. That bad? Worse." He coughed into his handkerchief, and I pretended not to see the red flecks on the cloth. This feels like '88, that same stillness before the door blows open. I worked through the night, hauled hay into the barn, filled every bucket and pot I owned with water, checked every stake and every passage, reinforced the weak spots with extra wire, made sure the canvas was tied down tight. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. The air was too still, too warm, too wrong. The storm hit at dawn on January 15th. I was in the barn doing morning chores when I heard it, not wind, not yet, but a sound like a train in the distance. I stepped outside and looked north. The sky was black from the ground to as high as I could see, rolling toward us like a wall of ink. I made it back to the house through the passage just before the wind hit. It didn't build gradually. It went from nothing to screaming in less than a minute. The shack shuddered. The windows rattled in their frames. Snow came sideways, so thick and fast that when I looked out the window, I couldn't see the barn. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. I know that because I checked. I was terrified, more terrified than I'd been my first winter, because this was the test. This was what Mercy had spent 28 years preparing for, what I'd spent 4.5 years building toward. If the system failed now, if the passages collapsed, if the wind tore through, if I couldn't reach the barn, then everything was over. The cattle would freeze. The chickens would die. I would be trapped in this shack until the storm passed, or I starved, whichever came first. I gave it 2 hours. Then I lit my lantern and opened the kitchen door. The passage was still standing. Snow had drifted against the entrance, but the walls were holding. The roof was holding. The wind was running over and around instead of through. I stepped inside, and the screaming of the storm dropped to a whisper. I walked those 50 feet the same way I'd walked them 100 times before, lantern in hand, wind above me, invisible, meaningless, the flame burning steady. At the barn, I found the cattle huddled in the shelter court, pressed against the bale walls that blocked the wind. The milk cow was standing calmly in her corner, chewing cud. The chickens were alive in their insulated coop. Nothing had frozen. Nothing had died. I fed them. I watered them. I walked back through the passage to the house and sat down at the kitchen table and put my head in my hands and cried. Outside, the storm raged for 9 days. The town came apart. I heard about it afterward, in pieces and fragments, from the people who survived it. The Peterson well froze solid on the second day. The marshes couldn't reach their barn. Their lane was open, exposed, and by the time the wind dropped enough to attempt the walk, 3 of their calves were dead. Old man Krebs tried to get to his stock on day 4 and lost 2 fingers to frostbite. The Hendricks boy went missing for an hour in the ground blizzard before his father found him curled against a fence post, nearly frozen. And then there was Duke Tolland. Duke had laughed at my passage system, called it a fire pile, said the first big blow would scatter it to Kansas. But Duke's barn had a 70-foot walk from his house, and his fancy lumber windbreak didn't stop a wind, it just redirected it. On day 3 of the storm, the wind found the gap in his north wall, tore off a section of roof, and buried his milk room in snow. His cattle started to freeze. The Platte River Girls' Home was 40 miles east, but the storm reached there too. The home's cow went dry from stress, and 23 girls had no fresh milk. Mrs. Hargrove, I learned later, stood at the window and watched the snow and wondered if the girl she'd laughed at was still alive. I didn't know any of this while it was happening. I only knew that my passages held, that I could reach my barn, that my cattle lived while I heard through the howling wind that the rest of the county was dying by inches. On the 9th day, the wind stopped. I woke to silence so complete that I thought I'd gone deaf. The storm was over. The sky was clear. The temperature was 23 below zero, and the snow was drifted higher than my head in some places, but the world was still again. I dug out my passages. I checked my animals. I walked to August's place, 3 miles through waist-deep snow, and found him alive, barely, wrapped in every blanket he owned, his fire down to embers. "You made it," he said when he saw me. "I made it. The passages held." He smiled, which turned into a cough, which went on for a long time. Mercy would have been proud. I got his fire going again. I brought him food from my root cellar, and then I went home and waited to see what would happen next. Mrs. Hargrove came first. I didn't expect that. I expected the Petersons, maybe, or the Bells, or one of the ranch families who'd been watching my system from a distance. I didn't expect to look out my window on the 11th day after the storm and see the matron of the Platte River Girls' home climbing down from a rented wagon, her face gray with cold and something else. She knocked on my door. I opened it. Miss Vale. Her voice was different than I remembered, smaller. "The home's cow is failing. The girls have had no fresh milk in 11 days. I was told, I heard that you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't ask. I stepped aside and let her in. "Sit down," I said. "I'll get you some coffee." She sat at my kitchen table, the same kind of woman who had laughed when the lawyer read my aunt's will, who had called me the butt of a dead woman's joke, and she wrapped her hands around a tin cup of coffee, and she looked at me like I was someone she didn't recognize. "I can spare milk," I said. "I've got a cow who's been giving steady all winter. I can pay. I don't want your money." She flinched like I'd hit her. "Then what do you want?" I thought about it. I thought about the laughter in that room, the way her lip had curled, the years I'd spent proving her wrong. I thought about revenge, about making her beg, about saying all the things I'd rehearsed in my head during the worst nights. Then I thought about Mercy, about what she would have done. "I want you to take the milk to the girls," I said. "That's all." Mrs. Hargrove started to cry. I didn't know what to do with that, so I went to the barn and filled 2 cans with milk and brought them back. She was still sitting at the table, still crying quietly. "The wagon's outside," I said. "The milk will freeze if you don't get it back soon." She stood up. She wiped her face, and then she said something I wasn't expecting. "Your aunt wrote to me once, years ago, before you came to the home." I went still. "She wanted to take you in. She'd heard about you somehow, I don't know how. She wrote and asked if there was a girl named Eliza who loved to read, who had no family, who might want to come west and learn about wind and weather and how to survive in hard country." Mrs. Hargrove's voice cracked. "I burned the letter. I thought she was crazy. I thought I was protecting you." The air went out of the room. "You had her letter." "Yes. And you burned it." "Yes." I could have screamed. I could have thrown her out. I could have said all the things that were boiling up inside me, about the years I'd spent being passed from family to family, about the placements that failed, about the cold and the hunger, and the nights I'd almost given up, about how different it might have been if I'd come here when Mercy was still alive, if I'd had her to teach me instead of her notebooks. But I looked at Mrs. Hargrove, at her red eyes and her shaking hands, and the way she couldn't meet my gaze, and I understood something. Punishing her wouldn't bring Mercy back. Punishing her wouldn't give me the years I'd lost. All it would do was make me into the kind of person who hoarded warmth in a blizzard. "I forgive you," I said. "Not because you deserve it, but because Mercy deserved to be heard, and I won't bury her twice." Mrs. Hargrove didn't say anything. She just picked up the milk cans and walked out to her wagon. I never saw her cry again. But she came back, the next day, with the home's cook, to learn how to keep a cow warm in a storm. And the day after that, with 2 empty buckets and a neighbor who needed help. And the line kept growing. They came for days, for weeks. Families I knew and families I didn't. The Bells came for hay. The Marshes came for advice on rebuilding their collapsed barn. The Petersons came for milk, then came back to learn how to build a passage of their own. Ranch wives I'd never spoken to showed up at my door with empty buckets and questions, and the look of people who had seen something impossible and needed to understand it. I gave to all of them milk, hay, advice, labor, I helped the Hendricks build a passage between their house and their stock shed. I showed Mrs. Peterson how to stack bales so they wouldn't collapse. I walked 3 miles through snow to check on August and ended up staying 2 days to help him rebuild his chicken coop. Duke Tolland sent his hired man on the 14th day. Not Duke himself, he was too proud for that. But his man came with a wagon and a request for 20 bales to replace the ones the wind had scattered. I could have said no. Duke had laughed at my work. He'd called it a fire pile. He told me it would be in Kansas before the first real storm. "Load 'em up," I told August, who had ridden over that morning. August looked at me. "He doesn't deserve it." "Maybe not." I watched the hired man stack bales in the wagon, not meeting my eyes. But the wind tried to kill all of us the same way. I won't do its work for it. August was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, like I'd passed some kind of test. "Mercy would have said the same thing," he said. Almost the same words. August died in late February, after the worst of the winter had passed. I found him in his chair by the stove, boots off, spectacles folded on the table beside him. A bowl of mushroom soup sat next to the spectacles, gone cold but not frozen. He looked like he'd just sat down to rest for a minute. I sat with him for a long time. The fire in his stove had burned down to embers, and the cold was creeping in, but I didn't move to fix it. I just sat there, in the chair across from his, and watched the light change on his face. He'd lost a son in 1888. He'd spent the rest of his life trying to make sure nobody else lost what he'd lost. And in the end, he'd helped me build something that might actually work. That had already worked. I buried him on his own rise, under a cedar marker I carved myself. It took me 3 days to dig through the frozen ground, and my hands bled through my gloves, but I did it. In spring, I planted red clover on his grave. He'd said once that useful things should bloom, and red clover was good for the soil. He left me his wagon, his tools, and his small sheltered lot with the cottonwoods. I moved my operations there the following summer. More room, better water, trees for windbreak. Half Sky Draw became a winter station, a place I'd go when the passages needed checking, but August's land became home. I married at 24. His name was Jonah Bell, Mrs. Bell's brother-in-law, a widower's younger brother who had first come to my door asking for wire and stayed to help stack bales. He was the kind of man who listened more than he talked, and he never laughed when I measured things. That was enough. That was more than enough. We had 3 children. I won't tell you their names or their stories. This story is about something else. The passages spread, slowly at first, then faster as Clara's pamphlet found its way into more hands. Ranch wives built them. County agents recommended them. A man from the university in Lincoln came out one summer to see what I'd built, and he left with notebooks full of measurements and a promise to write something for the agricultural journals. I built passages until I couldn't lift bales anymore. Then I taught others to build them, standing in the wind with young women who reminded me of myself, showing them how to stack and pin and brace. My hands knew the work the way a pianist knows a keyboard, without thinking, without looking, just knowing. The years went fast, the way years do when you're not starving or freezing or wondering if you'll survive. I got old. My children grew up and moved away. Jonah died one October, quietly, the way he'd lived. I kept building. I died on a Tuesday morning in March, decades after any of this began. They found me in the passage, the original one, the 50 feet between the shack and the barn at Half Sky Draw. I'd gone out there to show my grandson how to tie down canvas the right way, and I'd sat down on a bale to rest, and I'd never gotten up again. My daughter said I looked like I was just thinking, like I'd sat down to figure something out and gotten lost in the figuring. The passage still stands, if you want to know. They've rebuilt it 3 times using the same design Mercy sketched and I perfected, and August taught me to anchor properly. Ranch families still use it. School groups come to see it sometimes. There's a glass case in the county museum with one of Mercy's ledgers in it. Open to the page where she wrote, "On these plains, warmth is not made first by fire. It is made by stopping the wind." The same line I read by lamplight in a cold shack when I was 16. The same line that changed everything. Mrs. Hargrove laughed at me once in a room full of people when a lawyer read out that I'd inherited a wind-flayed quarter section with a 50-foot walk to the barn. A windbreak without the break, she'd called it. Even the dead can play a joke. But Mercy wasn't joking, and neither was I. And now, all these years later, that 50 feet is a lesson and a landmark and a living answer to everyone who ever said it couldn't be done. So let me ask you something. What are your 50 feet? I don't mean that poetically. I mean it literally. What is the distance in your life that everyone says is nothing? The stretch between where you are and where you need to be that people tell you should be easy, should be simple, should be survivable without help? What have you been walking through, exposed, because someone told you that building shelter was foolish? What gap in your life has been killing you slowly while everyone around you insists the problem is too small to solve? Maybe it's not a physical distance. Maybe it's something else entirely. The space between the work you do and the recognition you deserve. The gap between what you know and what people are willing to hear. The exposure you feel every day, walking through territory that everyone else seems to cross without effort. I spent 5 winters learning something simple. The surface is the least interesting part of any piece of land, and of any human being. What looks worthless from a distance might be exactly what saves you if you're willing to measure it properly. If you're willing to see what's actually there instead of what people told you was there. Mercy Vale knew this. She spent 28 years measuring wind and stacking straw, while people called her crazy. She died before she could finish what she started, but she left her notebooks behind. She left her measurements. She left the proof that she was right. I found those notebooks when I was 16, alone, with nothing. I read them by lamplight when I was too hungry to sleep, and I understood that someone like me had come before me, had seen what I was beginning to see, had been dismissed for it the same way I would be dismissed. The conditions don't have to be perfect. They almost never are. You don't have to wait until you have enough money or enough time or enough support. You start with what you have. You measure the problem. You stack what's available. You close the distance one bale at a time. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own 50 feet, your own open walk, your own windbreak that nobody else believes in, then hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary things with nothing but stubbornness and common sense. Your 50 feet are waiting. Start stacking.